The record that survives from ancient Egypt could have begun with a spell, with a plea to a god, with a hymn. Instead, one of the oldest surviving papyrus scrolls in the British Museum begins with a test. Not a riddle, not a puzzle, a weighing, a human heart placed on a balance scale. On the other side, a single feather, not as metaphor in a poem, but as a procedure, as measurement. This is the Papyrus of Ani, created around 1250 BCE, one scroll within what we now call the Book of the Dead. The Egyptians had a softer name for it, the Book of Going Forth by Day. It has often been dismissed as religious fantasy spells, gods with animal heads, monsters, tunnels through the underworld. But when you set aside the glass case, the museum audio guide, and the distance of 3,000 years, and you read it slowly as a human text, something else appears. It stops looking like superstition. It starts looking like psychology written in ink, accountability for how you treated other people. Framed as a journey after death, a mirror for the living disguised as instructions for the dead. And the Egyptians did not keep this logic only for tombs. The same ideas that shape the judgment scene in Ani's papyrus show up in texts used to teach the living wisdom instructions, copied by apprentice scribes, advice about bosses, envy, greed, the quiet violence of ordinary ambition. One of the most complete examples sits in the same museum, the teaching of Amenemope, preserved on Papyrus EA 10474, written during the Ramesside period, roughly 1300 to 1075 BCE. It does not sound mystical, it sounds blunt. Warnings about dishonest wealth, about using hunger as leverage, about what happens to a person slowly when power becomes a weapon instead of a responsibility. And then in the middle of all this seriousness, Egyptian literature does something unexpected. It exhales. Compositions now called Harper's songs, associated with tombs and funerary banquets, look straight at mortality and do not blink. They say in a voice that still feels strangely close, tombs crumble, time erases names, you can pray perfectly, and still your breath will stop. So do not spend your whole life pretending you are stone. When you layer these voices together, you don't get a single doctrine, you get a conversation. Some texts emphasize order, judgment, cosmic balance. Others emphasize fragility, joy, the brevity of a single day. That is not contradiction. That is life. And once you notice this, the story tightens. Because these texts are not museum curiosities. They are maps of tensions we still walk through now. We want meaning. We also want comfort. We want justice. We also want to escape consequence. We want to matter forever. We can barely live well for one afternoon. If you are drawn to hearing what ancient texts actually say about being human without mystic fog, without sensationalism, then this journey is for you. If you find value in explorations like this supporting the channel, or simply sharing where and when you're listening from, in the comments helps keep these deep dives alive. But it can wait. For now, get comfortable. Let the world outside your headphones dim for a while. The story begins in a place where paper should not have survived at all. Egypt wrote on reeds. Papyrus stalks sliced, pressed, dried into thin, fragile sheets. Not stone, not clay. Something that fire likes, that insects like that, flood and humidity, and careless hands like even more. Most of what was written is gone. Burned, eaten, rotted, thrown away. What remains feels like rescued breath. Fragments and scrolls that slipped through every kind of ending. The Papyrus of Ani is one of them. Today you can stand in front of it in the British Museum, catalogued as EA 10470. Unrolled, it stretches almost 78 feet, 24 inches high, painted in bands of color that should not by any reasonable standard still be visible after 3 millennia. Golds, reds, blues, greens, laid over pressed reed fiber that once grew along the Nile. The room is kept dim to protect it. That dimness does something else. It makes you aware you are trespassing, that this was never meant as a display. Because Ani's scroll was not written for scholars or tourists, it was commissioned for a single person, Ani, a scribe from Thebes during the 19th dynasty. This was his document, his guide for what he believed would happen after his body stopped breathing. And at the center of this scroll, among the spells and invocations and hymns, is an image that has become iconic, the Hall of Judgment. A long painted chamber lined with deities standing as witnesses. In the middle, a balance scale. On one side of the scale, a human heart. On the other, a single feather. The feather stands for Me'at, not just a goddess, but a principle, truth order, balance, the alignment of things, both cosmic and social. The heart stands for Ani's life. Every action, every intention, every moment that left a mark on someone else. The scale does not sway for drama. It does not tilt because of a clever speech. It is not moved by offerings or status. It simply measures. Beside it stands Anubis, jackal-headed guardian of the dead, overseeing the procedure like an attendant at a clinic. Near him, Thoth, god of writing and judgment, stylus in hand, recording the outcome. If the heart is heavier than the feather, heavy with cruelty, greed, dishonesty, another figure waits. Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, the devourer. If the heart balances, the journey continues. If it fails, the heart is destroyed. This is often treated as spooky myth, some exotic fantasy of an ancient religion. But its structure is not random. It is a system. The museum's own description names it plainly the weighing of the heart in the Hall of Judgment. Heart against feather, witnessed by divine figures who do not intervene. They do not argue your case. They do not twist the result. They observe. They record. No chaos, no loopholes, no last-minute bargains. In this picture of the world, the afterlife is not a place where anything might happen. It is where the weight of what already happened becomes unavoidable. That is the first quiet turn. Death is not the end of accountability. It is the moment when what was hidden, motive, pattern, impact becomes visible. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of thought, memory, intention. Not the brain, the heart. Which means in this scene, it is not an organ on the scale. It is a record. You cannot bribe that record. You cannot charm it. You cannot reframe it with clever language. The only question is, did you live in balance? Balance here is not about symmetry in a painting. It is me'at, a word carved into temple walls, spoken in court, invoked by kings, repeated in wisdom texts. A feather, a woman with that feather on her head, a principle, a presence. Mahat is truth, order, justice, alignment. She is the way the sun rises and sets in predictable arcs, the way the Nile floods and recedes, the way seasons circle back. That is Ma'at at the cosmic level. Her opposite is Fet, is disorder, not abstract evil, the very real chaos that seeps into human life through lies, exploitation, and violence. The Egyptians understood something we often pretend not to know. Societies rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They corrode, slowly, one justified cruelty at a time. A merchant cheats in the market. A judge bends the law for a bribe. A strong person crushes a weaker one simply because they can and discovers that the world does not punish them for it. Each act is small. Each act tilts the scale. Ma'at, as both goddess and concept, is there to say, this matters, and that is what the heart is weighed against. Not your beliefs, not your prayers, not whether you said the right words in the right temple. The papyrus is very clear. What is measured is who you became through action, piled upon action. As the papyrus of Ani moves through its spells and scenes, it circles back to this idea from different angles. Your life has weight, not just poetic weight, not just the weight of emotion, measurable weight. The trial is presented not as something subjective, but as a law of how the universe works. That is what makes this image so hard to shake. It was painted for a scribe, a man who spent his days with lists, tallies, precise marks. Ani's world depended on accuracy, on numbers that matched grain in a silo, on records that matched reality. And the central scene in his most personal document is not comfort. It is a procedure, a scale that does what scales do, as if this is simply how things are, as if everyone knows. But the Egyptians did not keep this vision locked away in tombs only to be sprung on people after they died. They trained the living with the same logic. If your heart is going to be weighed against Mayat, what exactly is being evaluated? Not, did you join the right cult? Or, did you perform the right ritual perfectly? Those mattered, of course, in temple practice. But in the moral texts, the focus is different. The question is, how did you treat people when you had the power not to? That question runs through Egyptian wisdom literature. Imagine a room in ancient Thebes during the Ramesside period. Not a temple, but a scribe school. Young men sit on reed mats, backs straight, holding brushes made from plant fibers frayed at the end. They dip the tips into cakes of black or red pigment mixed with water. Papyrus is expensive, so they often practice on pottery shards, ostraca flat flakes of broken vessels whose surfaces can be written on and wiped or discarded. Line by line, they copy sentences written generations earlier. Sentences that survived because someone decided they were worth repeating. One of these texts, now known as the Teaching of a Menemope, has come down to us on Papyrus EA 10474 in the British Museum. It is framed as a father or teacher addressing a son or student. 30 chapters. No thunder, no plagues. Just advice. Give your ears. Hear what is said. Give your heart to understand them. From there, it starts naming dangers, not demons, not curses, not supernatural traps. Quieter things, the arrogance of the one who knows more than those around him and uses that knowledge to belittle. The person who exploits legal loopholes to take what is not rightly theirs. The one who uses another's hunger as leverage. It speaks of greed not as simple desire, but as instability. A restless hunger that makes you cut corners, tell yourself you are smarter than everyone else, justify taking more because you can. Again and again, the teaching of Amenemope returns to one idea: inner discipline, not perfection, not holiness in the abstract, the ability to remain upright when the world tilts. Because it will tilt. You will meet unfair bosses. You will face opportunities to take advantage. You will find yourself with power over someone else. The text does not pretend life is fair. It does not promise that restraint will always be rewarded. It offers something more sober, a way to avoid corroding yourself from the inside out. This is moral psychology written as parental advice. It does not ask, "Do you believe in the gods?" It asks, "What do you do when no one can stop you?" The teaching of Amenemope is part of a broader genre, often just called instructions. There is the instruction of Ptahhotep, the instruction of Ani, fragments of teachings from various officials and elders. Each one presents itself as words from someone older, more experienced, to someone younger, just stepping into adult responsibility. They share a flavor: cautious, observant, wary of shortcuts, suspicious of unchecked ambition. They warn about hot-tempered people. Those who lash out quickly make permanent decisions from temporary feelings. They praise the quiet person who does not react immediately, who gives anger time to cool before acting. The contrast is clear. The heated man burns through situations and people. The silent man, as these texts use the phrase, is not weak. He is someone who has mastered the narrow space between feeling and action. That is not theology. That is emotional regulation, and it sits in the same world as the judgment scene. You can feel a shape forming. At one pole, the scale. Your life has weight. Actions echo. Balance will be measured. At another, the instruction. Life is unstable. You cannot control what happens to you. You can only control how you respond. Inner steadiness is the only real security. But if the tradition stopped there, it would be crushing. Always weighed, always watched, always responsible. The Egyptians knew this, and so, in the midst of warnings and judgments, another voice starts to sing, literally. Picture a tomb during the New Kingdom, not yet sealed, not silent. A banquet is underway in a painted chamber. Low tables hold bread, meat, beer in jars. Incense smoke curls through the air. Mourners and family members gather, dressed in linen, some with small cones of scented fat on their heads, slowly melting in the heat, perfuming the room. In one corner, a musician plays a harp. Sometimes there is also a singer. The instrument is carved on the wall behind them in many tombs, a clue that this was not an imagined detail, but a real practice. You might expect dirges, songs about eternal reward, reassurances about the afterlife. Instead, in some of these compositions, now called Harper's songs, you hear something far more disconcerting. They look straight at death and refuse to soften it. They note that the tombs of great people are in ruins, that the wise and powerful of old are gone, that their care, their preserved bodies, their elaborate spells and offerings did not stop time from doing what time does. No one comes back. So the songs say, in various wordings across the versions that survive, make your days pleasant. Do not let your heart grind itself down. Wear good linen. Put perfume on your head. Let music and companionship be part of your short era in the sun. These are not crude calls to party. There is an edge of defiance in them, a refusal to live your entire life as an audition for a future that cannot be guaranteed. Scholars have wrestled with these texts because they do not sound like what we expect funeral music to sound like. They undercut the very architecture they are sung within. The tomb says, "Prepare for eternity." The song says nothing material is truly eternal. Not all Harper's songs take this skeptical tone. Some reinforce the standard afterlife picture. Some speak of the dead enjoying the West, eating, drinking, existing in peace. The tradition is not one voice. It is a spectrum. At one end, confidence in continuation. At the other, deep doubt. In between, a range of uneasy middle positions. What matters is that the Egyptians did not censor this range out of their own ritual spaces. They allowed the voice that says you will be judged and the voice that says you are temporary to stand in the same room. That is not carelessness, it is honesty. So, 3 threads run through the surviving texts. Mayat, your life has weight. There is a scale whether or not gods are literally there. Actions have consequences, if not in a courtroom beyond death, then in the lived fabric of a community. Instruction restraint is survival. The world is unfair. Power will tempt you. Hunger will whisper that you deserve more. Your real work is to manage what that hunger does. Song, you are brief. Monuments crack. Names fade. Even perfectly righteous lives end. If you spend every moment bracing for judgment or chasing status, you may miss the only experience you are guaranteed this present breath. The remarkable thing is that ancient Egypt did not choose one and discard the others. They painted the scale on tomb walls. They copied Amenemope in schools. They sang the Harper's songs at funerals. They preserved the tension. Because anyone trying to live honestly has to hold all 3 voices at once. The need for meaning, the reality of consequence, the shock of impermanence. The scribes who wrote and recopied these works lived inside that tension themselves. In the mornings, they might copy a wisdom text urging restraint. In the afternoons, they might record funerary scenes emphasizing judgment. In the evenings, they might attend a banquet where a musician urged them to enjoy their short time above ground. Instead of resolving the conflict, they documented it. That in itself is a kind of wisdom. Because life is not simple enough for one rule. You can say, I will live as if my actions are weighed, and still need to be reminded not to postpone joy until some imagined future. You can say, I will enjoy my days, and still need to be reminded not to let that enjoyment become predation on others. Egypt did not give a single answer. It left tools, a scale, an instruction, a song. Now the focus turns back to where we started. The papyrus of Ani behind glass, the hall of judgment, the human heart, the feather. Earlier, it might have looked like a supernatural courtroom, something that awaits at the end, if any of this is literally true. But when you see it through the lens of all the other texts, the image shifts. It looks less like a threat and more like a mirror. Remember when Ani commissioned this scroll? He was alive. Someone mixed the pigments, cut the reeds, drew the lines, while he and his circle still walked in sunlight. They all knew exactly what this scene meant. It was not a secret rite. It was part of their shared moral language. That means the judgment was not meant only for the dead. It was meant to weigh on the living. What does your heart weigh is not a question asked once at the end. It is a question carried through every ordinary day. It is a form of accountability before the fact. The image says your choices leave weight. What you do to people around you does not vanish because you stop paying attention. When you use your advantage to harm, something accumulates inside you and around you. You can tell yourself a story about why it was necessary. The scale does not read your story, it reads your pattern. And the Egyptians grounded this idea not only in picture, but in practice. During mummification, most internal organs were removed and placed in canopic jars. The heart usually was not. It was left in the body or carefully preserved and returned. Because the heart was not just an organ, it was you. Thought, emotion, memory, moral record. In their view, preserving it was preserving the evidence. So when the heart appears on that painted scale, it carries all of that. Identity, history, character. The British Museum's own description is blunt. The heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Judgment depends entirely on that measurement. Light enough and you pass. Too heavy and you do not. Underneath the religious layer lies something more ordinary. What remains of you in any case is what you leave in other people. The colleague who learned restraint from you. The child who absorbed your way of handling anger. The neighbor who remembers that you listened. The person whose life narrowed because you weaponized your hunger against them. That is an immortality that does not require belief. It exists in consequence. The scale, in that sense, measures your echo. The Egyptians built an entire moral culture around making that echo hard to ignore. They did it in elite spaces, yes, palace inscriptions, tomb walls, papyri commissioned by wealthy scribes. There is a limitation there. The voices of the farmers, the builders, the women who wove and cooked and grieved are mostly missing. What we hear is a conversation among the literate class. People with status talking to other people with status about how not to ruin themselves and their world. Even with that narrow lens, certain principles rise again and again. The script itself toward the end boils them down into 3 phrases. Don't weaponize hunger. Don't break balance. Don't postpone life. You can watch them play out in the scenes and sayings already discussed. Don't weaponize. Hunger is the teaching of Amenemope, warning about greed that turns into exploitation. It is the step-by-step progression traced across multiple lines. Small arrogance. I see more than others. I deserve more. Small exploitation. Bending rules. Shaving measures. Taking a bit extra because everyone does it. Normalized exploitation, using legal tricks to strip others of what they need, convinced you are just smarter. Cruelty, no longer seeing real people on the other side of your choices. Only obstacles, resources, numbers. Egyptian texts treat that slide as predictable, not exceptional. They assume power amplifies what is already inside. If you walk into influence with unexamined hunger, that hunger will not stay small. So don't weaponize. Hunger does not mean do not desire. It means watch what your desire does when it meets vulnerability. Don't break balance returns us to the scale. Balance is not a vague spiritual feeling. It is social. Did you lie when truth was called for? Did you cheat when trust was required? Did you bring more fear or more steadiness into the rooms you entered? The heart holds the record. The feather represents the standard. The scene of weighing is revelation, not surprise. You can spend a lifetime ignoring balance. The weight still accumulates. Don't postpone life is the harper's song in the corner of the tomb. It is the reminder that you are temporary. That even if you follow every instruction, Even if you achieve perfect restraint and carry a feather-light heart, you will still die. So if all your days are lived only for an imagined inspection, you miss the only time you ever actually touch. The point is not to pick one of these and ignore the others. The point is that a life is lived inside the triangle they form. If you lean only on Me'at, you may become rigid, terrified of missteps. If you lean only on Amenemope, you may become controlled but joyless. If you lean only on the harper's song, you may slide into indulgence that slowly becomes its own imbalance. The Egyptian answer, such as it is not to choose. It is to let all three voices be present. 3,000 years later, in a different light, in different buildings, those same questions still land. We stand in museums, read translations, watch documentaries. We look at the painted scale, at the copied instructions, at the carved musicians, and ask, did they really believe this? It might be more piercing to flip the question. Why do we recognize ourselves in this? Why does a 1250 BCE image of a heart against a feather still sting? Why does a warning against exploiting the weak sound like it was written yesterday? Why does a funeral song about crumbling tombs feel more honest than many modern comfort speeches? The scenery has changed. The pressures have not. We still wake up with hunger for safety, for recognition, for more than we have. We still occupy positions where someone else is weaker, more vulnerable, easier to ignore. We still tell ourselves stories about efficiency, about necessity, to justify what that hunger does. We still build monuments, buildings, brands, profiles, projects, and quietly hope they will outlast us. We still fear they will not. The Egyptians did not invent these tensions. They acknowledged them. They refused, at least in these texts, to pretend that greed was rare, or that power was neutral, or that death could be warded off by preparing hard enough. They wrote again and again that these are permanent features of being human. Amenemope's student, practicing on a shard of pottery, felt the pull of shortcuts. The scribe copying Ani's judgment scene understood the temptation to trust in status and ritual over character. The musician at a tomb understood how easy it is to live as if there will be endless time for joy later. We are not being exposed to alien psychology. We are overhearing an old conversation about our own. The verdict in the end is not about whether Egypt was right or wrong in its metaphysics. It is about the fact that when you strip away gods and symbols, the underlying structure they described is still here. Hunger that can become a weapon. Power that can forget it is supposed to serve. Mortality that does not wait for anyone to be ready. The papyrus of Ani remains behind glass. The teaching of Amenemope sits in another case. Fragments of Harper's songs live on pieces of wall and copied lines from later periods. Asked to justify their survival, none of them could. They lasted because nothing destroyed them at the right times. Fires skipped certain buildings. Worms missed certain chests. Looters chose other scrolls. Yet the deeper reason they feel alive now is not accident. It is recognition. A young scribe in 1200 BCE copies a line about not shifting boundary stones to steal land. A translator in 1900 CE reads it and thinks of modern fraud. A listener today hears it and thinks of contracts clauses and the quiet ways power still moves wealth upward. The details vary. The pattern repeats. The teaching of Amenemope says that stability is not having enough money, enough walls, enough insulation from chaos. It is having enough inner control that you do not destroy yourself with your reactions. That claim is as hard now as it was then. It does not promise that restraint will always be rewarded, that the just will always prosper, that the cruel will always fall visibly. It only says every time you let hunger turn into harm, you add something to the load you carry. You feel it eventually in distances between you and others, in the brittleness of your own peace. The Harper songs say that no accumulation of wealth, of moral correctness, of reputation, stops the body from failing. That claim is as uncomfortable now as it was then. It does not say that meaning is an illusion. It only says if you postpone living until you are sure of your legacy, you will never live. The judgment scene says that whether or not gods literally place your heart on a scale, some kind of measuring is already happening. Not in a court beyond the sky, in the quiet knowledge you carry, in the faces of those you have shaped, in the trust you either strengthen or erode. That claim is not mystical, it is descriptive. These texts keep speaking because they do not flatter. They do not assure you that you are uniquely lost. They do not let you pretend you are uniquely innocent. They simply lay out what it is to be a person surrounded by chances to tip the world slightly more stable or slightly more broken. And then they leave you with a question they never answer for you. What does your heart weigh? So the story returns to its opening image. A balanced scale, a human heart, a feather. Not as an exotic artifact, but as a distilled picture of a question that will not go away. Not what did you believe? Not did you win? Not did you build something that others admire? Just what pattern did your life press into the people and places around you? The Egyptians framed that question in their own language, in gods, in halls and papyri, meant to guide one man named Ani through an underworld they thought was structured. We frame it in ours: ethics, psychology, impact, trauma, legacy. The vocabulary has changed, the core has not. You do not need to imagine Anubis and Thoth to feel the weight of that scale. You do not need to picture Amit to recognize that certain lines once crossed too often eat away at something you wanted to protect in yourself. The most unsettling and strangely liberating part is this: you already know in some deep, quiet layer when you are adding weight you do not want to carry. You know when hunger is becoming cruelty. You know when success is coming at the cost of someone else's stability. You know when you are postponing life for a day that never seems to arrive. Ancient Egypt did not give secret techniques to avoid that knowledge. It did not promise an escape hatch from consequence. It offered reminders: ink on fragile reed, paint on stone, songs at tombs. Don't weaponize hunger. Don't break balance. Don't postpone life. Not as commandments dropped from the sky, but as observations from people who had watched what happens when those lines are crossed in themselves and in others. The papyri behind glass are not magic. They are records of human beings who refuse to look away from three facts. Power is dangerous, breath is brief, and actions echo. If those records still feel sharp, it is not because they predicted our future. It is because they described their present honestly enough that it still matches ours. The question that closes all of this is not, do you accept their beliefs? It is quieter. Given everything you have just heard, given the scale, the instruction, the song, what do you want your own heart to weigh? Not someday on some mythic morning. Now. Imagine for a moment that Ani is not a name on a museum label, but a role. Not just a man in Thebes 3,000 years ago, but a kind of stand-in for anyone who works with words and records and quiet decisions. A human who spends most days handling details that don't seem grand enough to belong on a papyrus for eternity, and yet those days are what end up on the scale. Ani commissions a scroll to be buried with him. Today, we have other ways of leaving a record. We have feeds, messages, files, photographs. We trail data instead of ink. If someone in the far future assembled those scattered fragments of a single modern life, screenshots, transaction histories, the tone of emails, the choices made when no one was watching, what would they see? They would not see Ma'at or Anubis or a painted feather. But they might see patterns, places where hunger hardened, places where restraint held, places where joy was postponed, and places where it was allowed. The Egyptians built an actual picture of this in the Hall of Judgment. We carry an invisible version of it. Most of the time, we look away, not because we are evil, but because to stare at our own weight every day would be exhausting. So we move quickly. We fill moments. We explain and justify and keep going. The Egyptian texts invite a different pace. The scale in Ani's papyrus is not there to paralyze you. It is there to slow you down just enough to ask from time to time a question that almost no system around you will ask on your behalf. What am I becoming through what I am doing to other people? Not, what am I achieving? Not, what am I suffering? Not, what am I planning to do later? What am I becoming now, through repetition? The teaching of Amenemope makes clear that becoming is rarely dramatic. It is incremental. You adjust a number slightly once. You speak sharply when you could have stayed silent once. You take advantage of someone's desperation once. It feels small, justified, explainable. Then again. Then again. Over years, the heart grows heavier, grain by grain. In the same way, restraint is not a single, heroic act. It is the quiet choice made when you are tired, and no one will praise you for it, not to tip your hunger into someone else's fear. The Harper songs bring another element into that same self-examination. If breath is brief, if tombs crack, and names fade, then the question is not only, what does my heart weigh, but also, what am I doing with the little time when it is still beating? There is a way of living that is always rehearsing, always preparing, always deferring the moment when you actually let yourself inhabit your own life. The Egyptians knew that danger as well. They wrote texts that say in their own language, if you spend every day only trying to impress the scale, you may forget to feel the sunlight altogether. So the conversation is not be responsible versus enjoy yourself. It is more uncomfortable and more honest. You are responsible whether you acknowledge it or not. You are temporary whether you accept it or not. Both at once. From within that tension, the three principles that the text keeps circling: don't weaponize hunger, don't break balance, don't postpone life. Stop sounding like rules from outside, and start sounding like things you might say to yourself if you were completely candid. Don't weaponize hunger becomes, I know I want more. Let me notice when my wanting starts to steal from someone else's safety. Don't break balance becomes, I know I can tip the situation in my favor. Let me see clearly what that will do to the fragile trust between us. Don't postpone life becomes, I know I am afraid I have not done enough yet. Let me not sacrifice every day I have left to that fear. None of these require believing in an afterlife courtroom. They require only acknowledging that your presence leaves an imprint, whether anyone writes it down or not. The Egyptians externalized that truth into scenes and rituals because that was how their world worked. We internalize versions of it often without words. Moments when something in you recoils after a harsh word. Moments when you wake in the night remembering a small act of kindness or of cowardice that no one else may even recall. Moments when joy breaks through plans uninvited and you feel briefly what the Harper's songs were pointing toward. In that sense, the papyri are not foreign. They are what happens when a culture chooses to make visible what most cultures prefer to leave unspoken, that esteem status monuments, even carefully tended legacies, are all secondary echoes. The primary echo is in the hearts you helped lighten, or the hearts you helped load. Ani's papyrus seals this into a picture, a scale in a hall watched by gods. Your life may never be represented in paint. It may never be preserved on any kind of scroll. Most lives aren't. But the absence of a visible record does not mean the absence of a weighing. It happens quietly in the way people around you breathe easier or more shallowly when you enter a room. In whether your children or friends inherit more trust or more suspicion from the way you move through the world. In whether looking back from some future day, you feel that your own heart has grown lighter with age or denser. The Egyptian solution was not to remove fear or grief or desire. It was to give shape to the truth that these things are not weightless. Our tools are different. Our gods have changed or disappeared. Our monuments are taller, our data more detailed. But the underlying question their texts bring forward does not belong to them alone. It is older than their temples and will outlast their papyri. It is the question that rises in the quiet after the noise has faded and the story has run its course. If your days were gathered and held up to a feather, not of dogma, but of simple balance, what would you see not as accusation, as invitation, to notice, to adjust, to live a little more awake inside the same brief span you would have had either way?